Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Dee Dee Lageson, Executive Secretary for the Committee on the Present Danger, China. We appreciate your interest in our weekly webinars in which we expose and analyze the Chinese Communist Party's unrestricted warfare against America and the help being provided to the CCP in waging that warfare by captured U.S. elites. We encourage you to visit presentdangerchina.org for information on new programs, access to videos of our past webinars, and tons of other very valuable content. Please subscribe to our Substack at presentdangerchina.substack.com and follow us on X at CPDChina for updates and news. Our moderator today is Frank Gaffney. Frank is president for the Institute for the American Future, vice chair for the Committee on the Present Danger China, and host of Securing America on Real America's Voice.
Welcome, everyone, to this edition of our weekly webinar series sponsored by the Committee on the Present Danger China to address a topic that is not exactly top of mind for most of us. It may be top of the world. And it is, fortunately, very much on the mind of President Donald Trump. And as a result, it would seem be pretty much at the top of the national security agenda of the United States. We're going to be talking about the Arctic, and specifically the national security threats that are emerging from it as the ice recedes. There is a growing use being made of those waters for a northern transit route and for the installation of military bases and commercial operations, and of course the transit ships both on the surface and below the surface, all of which can have very profound implication for our country's interests more generally. We're also going to be talking about a very large island that runs basically from the Arctic down to practically the eastern coast of the United States, Greenland. And there has been a lot of talk lately since essentially Donald Trump brought it up, I believe, during the campaign and certainly after his election, as a very, very concerning problem, as we have learned, arising from the Chinese and Russian efforts to insinuate themselves into that very, very sparsely populated but vast landmass, especially with its abundance of natural resources and the prospect of being able to exploit them, again, perhaps to the detriment of this country's economic as well as national security interests, but also to project power from it in ways that would be quite contrary to those interests. We're going to be exploring all of this with, as usual, a superb team of national security practitioners, some of them members of our Committee on the Present Danger China, as well as other subject matter experts and individuals with I think, impressive familiarity with all of the issues that I've just touched upon. We're going to begin our conversation, as we often do, with a kind of intelligence brief, a short presentation by our friend Charles Sam Faddis, one of the members of our committee, also a former undercover operative of the Central Intelligence Agency, former Army officer, an assistant attorney general in Washington State for a time, as well as a very active contributor to the public policy debate in his columns and commentaries and analyses prominently made available to us all at And Magazine. That can be found at andmagazine.substack.com. Very strongly commended to you all. Sam was able to join me on our Securing America television program earlier today. He was unable to be with us for this program, but we were able, with his permission, to extract a piece of his interview to present it to you by way of introduction to today's topic, which we will be expanding upon with our subsequent presenters. Let's go to the videotape with Sam Faddis now.
One of the things that strikes me about this business with the Arctic, and focus here on the Chinese, you and I were talking not so long ago about Turkey, Erdogan, Ataturk, and essentially what I was saying was, look, we got this vision in our heads that Turkey is now a secular country and it's westernized and it's part of NATO, and this is all nailed down. Okay. And then we watched for about at least 3 decades as Turkey rapidly turned into something that looks increasingly like the Ottoman Empire with these expansionist aims, no longer aims, they're busy annexing Syria, and an increasingly overtly Islamic anti-Western rhetoric. But, I mean, yeah, you could find some think tanks talking about that, but U.S. policy didn't evolve, and now all of a suddenly we got whiplash. Oh my God, where'd this come from? Okay, well, it strikes me that we're kind of dealing with the same thing here. I mean, and as you well know, this is not unique to American strategy and national security. All right, when we think about the Arctic, to the extent we think about it, okay, whatever, it's up there, it's irrelevant economically. And to the extent we thought about it strategically or militarily through the Cold War with the Russians, it was, well, they got subs hiding up there and we probably need to find those. And okay, and beyond that, we haven't devoted a lot of thought to it, and we haven't done virtually anything about it. And when we think about the Chinese, everybody says, well, they're not an Arctic power, meaning they don't have the coastline that gives them claims in the Arctic. So they're irrelevant. So good, fine, we just we move on. And, of course, the world doesn't just stop changing. So the Russians have massive Arctic claims and Arctic coastline and operate there all the time. And they and the Chinese, it turns out, are not acting vis-a-vis the United States as independent actors or hostile. Now we have this increasingly close cooperation. I mean, as we're talking, there are rumors, as yet unfounded, that we may even have Chinese troops operating with the Russians in the against Ukraine. As yet to be proven, but we know the North Koreans are there. We know that the Iranians, the North Koreans, the Chinese, and the Russians are all cooperating against the United States. So we can't treat the Chinese as not being an Arctic power anymore. So that's kind of a wake-up call. That's like, wow, all of a sudden these guys have access. Also, while we're still concerned about ballistic missile subs, there's a whole nother dimension to this fight, right? The fight is our entire strategy for maintaining military superiority over the Chinese is based on the fact that we got high-tech stuff that they don't have, to put it bluntly. Our stuff is better. We've got all kinds of cool gee-whiz things, cutting-edge technology. They're way behind. Chinese know that, as we've discussed many times. They're focused massively on overcoming that edge and taking it away. Okay, what does that have to do with the Arctic? Well, in addition to the fact that the Arctic is awash in oil and natural gas, it also has massive deposits of so-called rare earth minerals. Everything we're talking about in this high-tech arena runs on those rare earth minerals. I mean, and the Chinese already have essentially a stranglehold over those. And so even the premier American companies that you think are cutting edge, Tesla, SpaceX, Elon Musk's whole empire, is completely dependent on rare earth minerals coming from China. So and we largely do not produce them, and beyond that, we don't refine them. So the Chinese can cut that off. And as we speak, we're in the middle of a growing trade war with the Chinese. Well, they have already restricted, if not stopped, the export of those rare earth minerals. So just like coal once upon a time was the lifeblood of the world economy, oil to a certain extent is. This is not incidental. This is not your iPhone might cost you a little more. This is the whole game now. You're talking about the Defense Department wanting to build whatever generation of fighter aircraft we're on now that will preserve our technological edge, increasingly dependent upon AI. Well, to make any of this happen, to maintain this superiority, we have to have these rare earth minerals. We can't do that and be in a confrontation with the Chinese if they've got a stranglehold over it. We're already in a trade war where they're telling us they're not going to send them to us anymore. And some of the world's largest deposits of these things are sitting up in the Arctic. And we are nowhere close to being ready to access them, defend them, control them. As an example, you're talking about Chinese, Russian access to the Arctic working together. The U.S., I believe, has a grand total of 3 operational icebreakers. The Russians have 53. So we are way, way, way behind on this, and it's critical.
And thank you. And thank you especially for introducing the fact that this conversation is taking place, of course, in the midst of the president's concerted effort to try to rectify trade imbalances around the world. Most especially, the most egregious of them is that with the Chinese Communist Party. I'm fond of noting, and I've done so on these webinars rather consistently, that the Chinese communists have been at war with us for decades, unrestricted warfare, as we mentioned earlier, but explicitly so since May of 2019, when they declared in the pages of People's Daily that there was a people's war underway now against the United States. The trade war has been an undeclared one, but very much part of the unrestricted dimensions of this conflict, this pre-kinetic conflict, let me be clear. And what I think Sam has just laid out is preparations that have been made by the Chinese, in part with our financial support, in part with the windfalls and the trade imbalances that they've engineered, to prepare that nation for actual war against us, the old-fashioned kind, the shooting war kind, in other words. And what we're talking about now is, especially as the American people have seen how the Chinese have responded, the complete unwillingness, really, to negotiate on reducing barriers to trade and to engage in even more restrictions, including, it appears, with respect to these rare earth minerals. And that will only be the beginning of it, of course, given our supply chain dependencies. But what we're interested in here in this webinar is examining the extent to which new avenues of attack, if you will, are opening up as a result of the collaboration in part of the Chinese with their Russian junior partners in this no limit partnership, and in terms of what they are seeking to accomplish through the Belt and Road Initiative and the colonial infrastructure that it entails in places like Greenland. And if they were successful, what it would mean for us. To address that topic, I'm very pleased to say we have with us a man who has devoted considerable time and energy to his study of Greenland. He actually has a family tie to it by virtue of his father's, I think it was, service there during World War II. Thomas Dans is his name, He has served in the Treasury Department. He has been an Arctic Commission commissioner. He is these days actively engaged in, I think, public advocacy in connection with this exercise in establishing an American presence in and ability to properly defend Greenland. And we've had the benefit of his counsel on some of this in the past, and we're very appreciative of him taking the time to talk about Greenland, how vital it is to U.S. security interests in the Arctic and the North Atlantic. We have him via video as well.
I think one thing that's important for the folks to understand is, hey, this didn't, like anything in China, this didn't just start yesterday. It didn't start as soon as President Trump won in November for the second, third time. This has been a move by China for decades now. And it's been something that's been a gradual progression on multiple different fronts. Of course, the kinetic front is always the last. And so we need to kind of put that away from our minds, which is, you're not going to see it, you're not going to feel it until it happens, and then it's too late, right? So the kinetic thing you have to kind of put away and be able to examine the pacing of this on other spheres. One of the key things, China is not just focused on the Arctic, they are focused on the poles. Because this goes back to the whole philosophy of anything that isn't tied down or claimed elsewhere, they want an equal or greater cut of themselves. That's from the very center of the Earth to the very heights of the universe, right? So they're focused on that. And so you're seeing this both in Antarctica as well as the Arctic, right? So that's a point to make. One of the first things China did was literally reinvent the map. And what I mean by that is there's something called the HAO projection, HAO. But in 2004, they basically took the idea that the world is, because of distortions in the Mercator projection, when you spread the world map out horizontally, it tends to reduce the effect, the proximity of all the world's landmass really in the northern hemisphere. And their point was that China is more central. Remember, the Middle Kingdom. So they basically decided to split the map on a line of latitude, 60 degrees south latitude, and come up with something called the HAO projection, which shows that, of course, 80% of the world's landmass in the center, but it basically makes the center of the map the Arctic. And you'll see that China ends up pretty close to things in that. So that's the jumping off point for the near Arctic notion. That came out in 2013, just as the Belt and Road Initiative was getting launched formally. So that was kind of one current moving on the side of this. So what you've seen since then with a pretty aggressive kind of move in various kind of scientific and commercial spheres, as well as into multilateralism. So China is kind of one of their first moves, and they weren't involved in any of the Arctic exploration. This is an important thing for the viewers to know too. We can't get too far into the history, but they should respect that a lot of Greenland was discovered by Americans in the 19th century, right? In fact, much of the naming on the northwest side of the continent or the island itself are American place names, because we're the first ones to prove that it was an island. China got there late in the picture. But what they did was, if people remember the financial crisis in 2008 in Iceland, they were very quick to the aid of Iceland. And flowing out of that, Iceland became the original champion for China into the Arctic, and arguing for them to have something called permanent observer status in the multilateral body that really focuses on, that's the Arctic Council that focuses on Arctic issues. So China became an Arctic kind of stakeholder, if you will, back in 2014, and they've advanced since then. Now, fishing and seafood is a tremendous kind of vector that they've worked in. And it's not, like I say, it's not just Greenland. You can't divorce the move in Greenland away from the rest of the Arctic. So China's been on the march in Iceland way before Greenland. Now, Greenland is, for the listeners, 90% of the economy today is seafood. Right? We talk about mining, we talk about critical minerals. Yes, that's very important. That's huge for the future. And China well recognizes that Greenland has some of the biggest untapped supplies of richest holdings of critical minerals. But seafood is a lot where the action is. So and then rolling forward into the present day, you've just seen elections occur in Greenland, where a new kind of government's been stood up. It's a coalition. It's a very balky thing. They brought kind of together some really strange bedfellows in terms of the former Communist Party. Now they're called the Liberal Party, or Left Liberal Party, as well as the far, kind of the Conservative Party, and everybody into this. But one of the first things that came out was the new foreign minister saying we'd like to increase our trading activity with China. We see that as a priority. We need to look east, not west. And in fact, just as the tariffs go up to 125% today from the U.S. and China, Greenland's now talking the opposite direction. They want a free trade agreement with China. So you have to see that you've got a very kind of strange dynamic happening here, where there's an island which basically the United States, again, remember, Denmark, this is a colony of Denmark that was a colony until World War II, until April 9th of 1940. That's when really the history of of Greenland rather, changed dramatically. That's when the Danes basically abandoned Greenland. They fell to the Nazis within 2.5 or 3 hours, depending on how you want to measure it. And that's when the United States moved in. And Greenland actually became a part of the United States there in 1941. And just yesterday, I think, was the anniversary of that, 2 days ago, April 9th. That's when Greenland became a protectorate, and it was made a protectorate until, I think, May 5th of 1945. When Denmark was liberated, or the following days. And basically the country was kind of handed back to now the free Denmark, if you will. But that's an important part to realize, because hundreds, if not thousands, of Americans died defending Greenland. So we have tried to bring this up into consciousness. And you saw that very effectively with the vice president's visit there a few weeks ago. So you're in a situation where we have the key architecture of our security assets sitting in Greenland. And yet that island, other than the U.S. presence there, is scarcely protected. The Danes have 4 40-plus-year-old ships patrolling a 27,000-mile coastline, if you will. It's just not serious, and a couple dog sleds. There's billions of dollars necessary to bring this up to a safe level.
I think you get the gist of his message. We're dealing with a huge landmass, replete with abundant resources and a geostrategic location of enormous consequence. And what I think prompted us to make it a protectorate in World War II is very much what's operating at the moment, as the threats are, if anything, vastly greater to Greenland and to us from that quarter, arising from the Russians as well as the Chinese operations in the region. We're going to turn next to a woman who steeped herself in understanding this particular problem as a result of her time serving as the U.S. ambassador to Denmark, which actually also entails her representing our interests with respect to Greenland and the Faroe Islands. Her name is Ambassador Carla Sands. She has been, in addition to a U.S. ambassador, chairman and CEO of a private venture and real estate company, and is now the vice chair of the Energy and Environment Group at the America First Policy Institute. We caught up with her on our television show as well in the day, and we are able to give you highlights of what she told me on that occasion about why Denmark is simply incapable, building on the point that has just been made by Tom Dans, simply incapable of securing Greenland, and why it is vital to the American interests to be helping do that in the immediate future. So we'll go to the videotape with Ambassador Sands at this point.
Most Americans don't think about the Arctic. We don't think about Greenland at all. It's far away, we feel like, but it's actually part of North America. It's the world's largest island, and it's just off our northeast coast. However, it's part of the Kingdom of Denmark, and Denmark's over in Northern Europe. It's been part of the kingdom for hundreds of years, and the Greenlanders want to go independent. I thought that was decades away, but just a few months ago, their premier said, "We are going independent." And it sounds like it's not that far off. So that, of course, increases the stakes of the security of Greenland, as it is part of North America, and if it were to fall into adversarial hands, it would be so much more dangerous than, for instance, Russia and China's activity in Cuba, because it's so large and because of the wealth that it contains. The CCP looks at the globe from the poles, not from our country's landmass like we do in the West, like the US or Europe would look at the map, and we have America in the middle. They look from the top and the bottom. Anne Marie Brady wrote a great book called China as a Polar Great Power. And in 2018, the CCP put out a white paper called The Polar Silk Road. And it's about China's ambition to rule the poles, to have a say in governance, in everything, security. And they say that they are entitled to 40% of all the wealth under the sea and under the ground in the poles. They called themselves in this paper a near polar nation. There's no such thing. You're either a polar country or you aren't. And the United States is one of the polar countries. Russia has the biggest polar land mass. They have about at least half of the polar landmass if you look at the map from the North Pole. We have Canada, the U.S. state of Alaska, and then countries like Norway and Sweden. And if you look at the security issues, you would think, oh, well, it seems very peaceful up there, and it was for hundreds of years. But now we have Russian subs and ships, we have Chinese ships, and they are working together in a no-holds-barred military partnership, and you could say also some economic partnership. So China's shipping goods with the help of Russian icebreakers through the Northern Sea Passage, for instance. And this is cutting down about 20% of the transit time, so it saves the Chinese shippers money. But with Chinese activity, shipping and things like that, comes their military as well, as we know. And Russia's been cutting sea cables around Greenland. China vessels have been doing the same thing not that far away. So there's a lot of mischief. They've been mapping the seabeds. They want to have more control in the region. I think if you think about the people of Greenland, they're peaceful people. They want to have a great life just like Americans do. They want more opportunity, and they're controlled largely, although they're semi-autonomous. Denmark has their security and their foreign policy under their control. However, Denmark is only a country of 5.5 million people. It's about the size population of the state of Colorado, and their GDP is about the same too. So they don't have the capacity to defend Greenland. And don't forget about the Faroe Islands, because it's not just the land masses that they have to defend, it's also the seas around them. The seas around them are gigantic and they're very rough. They're not friendly seas. And it's called the GI-UK gap for Greenland, Iceland, and the UK. Because don't forget, Iceland used to be part of Denmark too until they went independent. So because of Denmark's lack of economic ability to defend their territory, and the seas, to have even knowledge of what's around out there as far as subs and ships. They're not able to secure Greenland. President Trump looks at the Western Hemisphere and says things are not under the control like they should be if you look at the Monroe Doctrine. I believe it's time for a new Monroe Doctrine. He's looking at securing the Panama Canal for the use of American commercial, but especially military vessels. China was controlling that port. I went down. I visited the canal. I watched the movie. It was China from wall to wall. That's going to change now. We look at South America. The largest trading partner of most South American country is China. And then you look at Greenland. Chinese companies own a minority interest in a majority of the rare earth mines in Greenland. The Chinese Communist Party tried to pull Greenlanders into their Belt and Road Initiative in 2017, flew over the premier and his government and their big CEOs, rolled out the red carpet. What can we do? They tried to finance and build, with state-owned enterprises, 3 airports that the Greenlanders were pining to have. And you have to understand, there's no infrastructure in Greenland. Most of what is there was built by the U.S. military from World War II until we left at the end of the Cold War. That's their ports and almost all of their airports. So Greenland is ripe for an investor. And President Trump is the kind of guy that can get a deal done. He hasn't offered a deal yet, but the Danish government is terrified that the United States will supplant them in the relationship with Greenland. They want Greenland to be part of the kingdom. It makes them a big power. However, Greenlanders are going independent. The Danish government is not listening to the Greenlanders. They're going independent. That's happening. It's just a matter of time. So the Danes have tried to poison the Greenlanders' minds about the United States, our intentions, about President Trump, through their press, through polls that they did from Denmark, through propaganda. They've made a law now that only people in the kingdom can propagandize the Greenlanders. Okay. So there's all kinds of machinations happening, and the Danish government is furious. Now, I heard a rumor that Canada and the EU are going to team up to fight against Trump and his intentions in Greenland, to come to the aid of Greenland, that it's going to be Canada and the EU. So let's see what unravels. I learned that in Europe not that long ago. So I think that the Danish prime minister went to Europe, went all over looking for support, and this is probably what they cooked up. So let's see what happens, because we know they can't defend anything without the U.S., certainly not against the CCP. And let's not forget, it's not like the CCP would land boats on the shore. It's all about economic coercion, about propaganda, about all of the gray zone war that the CCP wages. President Trump is aware of this. So it's about development in Greenland, which the U.S. government can backstop American companies with Exim Bank and Development Finance Corporation to help companies have the confidence that they can invest in a really difficult place, because it's a tough environment in Greenland. It's only 57,000 people there. So I think that President Trump's proposal about us securing Greenland against our adversaries is a brilliant one. I wrote a paper on it a few years ago, and I think that it actually has merit and that we should be talking about it more. We need more surrogates talking about the importance of securing Greenland against adversaries.
The point I think that was being made there is precisely the point of this webinar, which is we want more people to be aware of the critical issues associated with the status of Greenland and more generally the Arctic, and to become advocates for the American presence in and defensive capabilities being brought to bear on behalf of people who do not want to be enslaved by the Chinese communists or the Russians, or worse yet, a combination of the two. We're going to hear finally from a man who has studied closely both the Russians and the Chinese, and notably their so-called no limits partnership. how they are conducting themselves, often now jointly in military exercises and collaborations of other kinds, and how both the Russians and the Chinese have designs clearly on the Arctic, that Northwest Passage, the surrounding areas, and who certainly understand the strategic importance to the United States of both Greenland and this so-called GI-UK gap, this Greenland, Iceland, United Kingdom gap, through which vessels, particularly from Russia now, former Soviet Union, must move in order to get into the southern reaches of the Atlantic, all of which has been demonstrated during World War II, notably, as of vital importance in the event there is any kind of conflict which we are engaged. Our next presenter's name is J.R. Nyquist. He has a blog entitled jrnyquist.blog. He is the author of a number of books, including Origins of the Fourth World War and the Coming Wars of Mass Destruction. Jeff is a member of our Committee on the Present Danger of China. We're very pleased to have him with us to round out this conversation with his insights into the emerging military threat from the Arctic. And given the state of the U.S.-Canada alliance, are we up to the challenge? Jeff, it's great to have you with us. The floor is yours, sir.
The strategic nature of the Arctic basin, I'll start with geography. Because the world's a sphere, the shortest Chinese air route for European air traffic is through the Arctic. The Northwest Passage, if it can become effective, is shorter than the Panama Canal, which could be cut, of course, by the Americans. The main approach route for Chinese and Russian bombers into the USA is through the Arctic. Presently, Chinese bombers are based in Russia now, Chinese strategic bombers. I learned this when I was at the Arctic conference in Canada there in September. The main direction for missile strikes crosses the Arctic region, and one of the main transit routes for submarines is the Arctic. Second factor in what's going on up there is that we often look at a map and we don't see the north, we see the other fronts. But the Arctic is a front because of this geography. And NORAD, the North American Air Defense Command, which is a joint American-Canadian command, I had the opportunity to meet the recent commanders of that command, Canadian and American. And what they told me was that they only have 40 ABM interceptors at present. They have only 24 fighters for interception. The basing infrastructure in the Arctic far north, in Canada in particular, what used to be a line of bases, has largely been abandoned, and the infrastructure has not been kept up. Russian and Chinese forces are training for paradrops in the Arctic, suggesting they're in a position to seize those bases. Ottawa and Washington are simply not interested in putting resources into the Arctic when they really need to be. Now the threats to the United States through the Arctic, it's important to look at these threats. Russian hypersonic missiles could actually be launched from Russian bombers flying over Siberia, and they could reach America's northernmost cities. And these missiles, they go way up before they go down. And they, according to General Van Herk, who had been the head of Northern Command and also NORAD, said there's no way to intercept these missiles once they come down low. There's no even way to track them. You can't even tell what target they're going to because they can change direction in flight. Then you have the 9 Russian submarines that are based off the U.S. coasts, 5 Russian submarines off the east coast, 4 off the west coast, carrying these new long-range Russian cruise missiles that basically are very difficult to intercept. Maybe a fighter plane could get one, but they also hard to track, and of course carry nuclear warheads, can carry nuclear warheads. The Chinese strategic bombers, which I mentioned before, that are based in Siberia, are able to strike the United States through this weak access point in the Arctic. If you use cruise missiles from Chinese submarines against our surface-to-air missile sites here in the U.S., you could clear a path, and General Clancy gave a presentation about this. You could clear a path so that a place like Chicago could be bombed, not with nuclear weapons, but just with conventional bombs. There'd be no way to stop it if the attack was planned correctly from China and or Russia. The Russian Northern Fleet, this is something that's been in the Russian press for about 5 or 6 years. The Russians are building icebreakers. The Chinese, let's say they need Russian support in the Pacific. The Russian Pacific Fleet is rather weak compared to the Russian Northern Fleet, which is based in Murmansk. There has been discussions of how to move the Russian Northern Fleet into the Pacific under emergency conditions. This is something that's been discussed and the Russian military is looking at. It would be very dangerous. Imagine if the entire Russian fleet could be massed in the Northern Pacific together with the Chinese fleet. Imagine the threat to Alaska and the threat to our West Coast. Then you have the issue of the Chinese infiltration of Canada, as noted in the 1997 Sidewinder report. It has been declassified now. I discovered when I was in Canada recently. It is a joint report of the Canadian Royal Mounted Police and the Canadian CSIS, the Canadian CIA, on Chinese using triads, organized crime, and basically infiltrating the Canadian economy and laundering money through urban real estate to influence Canadian politics. And I think when I was up there, I had a chance to meet with some Canadian politicians, and they told me, look, you have to warn your American friends, we have been taken over from the inside by China. And it's no joke. So already the Chinese have gotten their hooks deep into Canada. And of course, the Chinese infiltration doesn't just stop at the political level. The Chinese have tried to bribe indigenous Canadian tribes in the far Arctic North to get access to develop ports on the Canadian Arctic and to develop mines, economic resources. But this would just be a way to get a toehold, because China's primary interest would be, of course, to create bases, air bases for moving troops, for moving bombers and fighters. That would be something that they would want to get in. Once you had China establishing some kind of sovereignty in the north, and that would be possible because in Canada, the indigenous tribes have sovereignty. That's something that we don't have with Indian tribes in the United States. And so you have this difficulty where China actually could flip territories over to themselves. This is something that some Canadians told me that they're concerned about. Now, Chinese economic strategy in the Arctic, and it's worth touching on that for if there's a long-term strategy here. I must note that in Brazil, nobody's tracking this. China is backing this new PIC system through the Bank of Brazil. And it's an end run on the SWIFT dollar system for being able to trade, for customers to be able to use any currency they want, to buy goods in another country, and to be able to move that currency without a tax, without having to pay anything. I think the Chinese fronting this, they may be willing to lose a lot of cash themselves to do this. I think we'll find in the coming days that China is really involved in this. And of course, we saw the dollar go to $3,200 an ounce. We saw gold go to $3,200 an ounce. This does not reflect a real increase in gold as much as a decrease in the value of the dollar. So there is this attack on the dollar that China's doing. And the Arctic has a role to play in that, because President Trump's tariffs, as they alienate Canada and Europe, and of course the tariffs on China, these countries drawing together will make the Northwest Passage and the Chinese air route through the Arctic to Europe more important for China, as Europe becomes a more important trading partner for China. And then control of the Arctic by China, if they can claim sovereignty as they have over the South China Sea, they and the Russians together could block the U.S. access to resources in the Arctic. The conclusion then, I would say, is that if Russia or China can establish bases in the Arctic, particularly Greenland and or northern Canada, they can directly threaten the United States from the. If you draw a straight line, it's much harder for them to approach directly over the Pacific or the Atlantic. Their approach to us together would be through the north, and which is, by the way, not presently protected, as our NORAD commanders would show. And the second point on the conclusion is that China and Russia's active measures, we don't really grasp the fact that President Trump's policies, perhaps influenced by this idea that Russia and China can be divided, has alienated Canada and Europe. And of course, this makes Greenland, and, because Greenland's controlled by Europe, and Canada is also independent of the U.S. If those countries become alienated from the United States, then it becomes even more wide open for attacking the United States through that direction. And so that's my presentation.
Well, thank you. A lot of food for thought and not a little anxiety, I think it's fair to say. Jeff, you are the last man standing, as they say, the only participant who is with us live, and I very much appreciate you thereby being available for some questions and give and take with me on what we've been discussing here. I do want to start maybe with your last point. Clearly, one of the issues that has come to the fore since President Trump came back to office is the relationship with Canada. The government of Canada has become increasingly, well, not just admiring of, under Justin Trudeau particularly, and I think it's fair to say as well, penetrated by, under the influence of the Chinese Communist Party. Witness this this study that you mentioned. What I'm interested in is your thought, as we've seen issues arising over tariffs, in particular in Canada, whether and an imminent election there, by the way, as well. Whether you anticipate that what you've warned could happen is in the process of happening, or enduring alienation of the Canadians from this relationship. You talked about NORAD, for example, as an important part of our defense establishment in partnership with that of Canada. Walk us through that, if you would.
Yeah. It would be a catastrophe if Canada pulled out of NORAD, and of course there has been discussions of this in Canada. I've talked to some of my Canadian friends since the Arctic conference in September. Everybody, during that conference, everybody expected that the elections that were going to happen this year, they didn't know when, they expected the Conservatives to win. They did not expect the Liberals to be ahead. But unfortunately, because of the tariffs, because of Trump's jokes about, well, they're not really jokes, about annexing Canada, it has damaged the Conservatives in Canada who have had to go against Trump so as not to appear unpatriotic. Of course, we haven't seen the stirring of Canadian patriotism until this moment. We've seen quite a stirring of it. If you've watched a hockey game recently, you'll see they're not very happy. Canadians are not happy with us. This is a very bad situation because it gives an opportunity to the Chinese, who have been really preparing their positions in Canada. And it's paralyzed the Canadian Conservatives. I spoke to a Canadian politician here a couple of weeks ago who told me that he does not expect the Conservatives to win the election. And this is very bad because the Liberals are very much in bed with China in Canada.
Under the prospective new premier, as well
Carney,
as,
yes.
Of course, the previous one. Yeah. The idea that Canada and Europe might join forces in a kind of anti-American mode, not necessarily a direct threat, certainly the military kind, but to, as I think was said by several of our presenters, sort of diminish the likelihood that the United States is able to secure Greenland as it should and arguably must be. Do you see that as a kind of new partnership that could compound not only the degree of penetration by the Chinese, but also the antipathy these allies, putative allies at least, of the United States might exhibit towards this country?
There is a kind of disconnect. People have to be careful about being ideological or making ideological judgments about Europe and Canada from the American point of view. You could say that Europe especially is quite social democratic compared to the United States. And this has been used by certain people on the right to say that Europe is communist even. It's not true. The Social Democrats in Europe believe in freedom, perhaps not as perfect a freedom as Americans like, but they would stand very much against any dictator or any enemy that threatens freedom. And that makes them natural allies of ours. And we have to not forget this, that China and Russia have this partnership. They call it an unlimited partnership, primarily because they share a similar social system. They're autocratic, they're totalitarian, they're imperialist. They have ambitions to control other people's land. And they realize that the liberal system, so-called in the West, is for rule of law. You don't go seizing people's land. You don't claim that waterways belong to you and nobody's allowed to traffic them. There's a certain, order that was established after World War II, and the United States was the guarantor of that order. If the United States no longer guarantees that order and suddenly reneges on this and suddenly actually tries to annex the territory of NATO countries, Greenland is a NATO ally, a territory of a NATO ally. Canada is the territory of a NATO ally. I am dumbfounded that Vice President Vance would say that America will respect the sovereignty of Greenland when he's standing on Danish territory advocating its transfer to the United States. I mean, this is not something you do to allies. I don't know if you've seen the Canadian Foreign Minister, Jolie, talk about how she had to explain to Canadians. I mean, she had to explain to European foreign ministers that basically Trump wasn't joking. This Canadian politician I spoke to the other day said that these tariffs are going to crush Canada. Now Trump has put a pause on the tariffs, if I understand what happened yesterday correctly, and that's a good thing. But the way that a third of Canada's economy is wedded to trade with the U.S., if you raise these tariffs, you will destroy the Canadian economy. You'll just completely destroy it. And yeah, you might have Canada on its knees so that they would be annexed. But that's aggression. That's an act of aggression. That's using the trust of this long-standing, the biggest demilitarized border in the world and one of the most long-standing trade relationships in the world, and you are using that as a weapon to annex another country. I mean, this is why Canadians are so enraged. And I just hope that we can understand that we need, with Russia and China being united, I think it was Andrei Illarionov who called it a kindergarten psychology to think we could divide China from Russia in a recent talk he gave. And it is a kindergarten psychology. We're being divided from our allies. We have to stay united with what we have, not divide us from our allies thinking we can divide our enemies.
This is a moment when obviously there is a heightened awareness, I think, beginning to set in on the part of the American security establishment that some of these alliances are under strain at the minimum, and the Chinese in particular, to some extent the Russians as well, have been filling vacuums of power. Jeff, say a little bit more about the extent to which this is translating into collaboration of a very military character between the Russians and the Chinese, But we've seen them engaged in exercises as far away from each of those countries as South Africa, with the Iranians, no less, naval exercises. But give us a sense of what is taking place with aerial penetrations of our air defense identification zone, and more generally the strategic nuclear exercises that now, I guess, with some regularity, involve the forces of both countries. You mentioned bombers being stationed in Chinese bombers being stationed in Russia as something that is obviously part and parcel of those exercises, but perhaps on a more enduring basis as well.
The Chinese and the Russians have done joint air exercises where they have challenged U.S. airspace in Alaska. They have approached to Alaska. They've done this to Japan as well, with both aircraft and ships, and to South Korea. So all of the North Pacific and Arctic positions have been challenged by joint forces, naval and air forces. When the Russians had a major exercise in the North Pacific, it was 2021, I think it was July. It was not known at the time, but found out later that Chinese submarines were part of that exercise. So that was a joint exercise, and it wasn't that far from Hawaii. The Russians have even done exercises where their strategic bombers have become involved in exercises that China has had regarding Taiwan. We forget that Russia has a Far Eastern position with Far Eastern troops, air units, and naval forces, and that these, combined with North Korea and China, is the point in the North Pacific where all three of these forces can work together. It is interesting that North Korean delegations, and we recently had Sergei Shoigu visiting North Korea here within the last couple of weeks. He went to Pyongyang with quite a considerable entourage. We have Chinese and North Korean military personnel landing in Novosibirsk. Goodness knows there's some kind of planning or a joint working together of the North Korean, Chinese, and Russian militaries. And of course, if these three militaries are working together, this is a triple threat against the United States position in the Pacific and also in the Arctic. Because really the shortest distance between China and the United States it's to Alaska. Right? That's the closest American position to China is Alaska, the closest American territory. And so we have to realize these exercises on Taiwan, yes, they want to blockade Taiwan, but it's very interesting that China would build like the Type 71 amphibious transport. It can reach in one fuel load, it can reach certain positions on the West Coast in one trip. Why, if Taiwan is the main interest, that they're making transports and assault ships that have such range to them? And of course, there's Chinese sources saying that they want to go beyond the second island chain. And we've seen their activities in the Solomon Islands and elsewhere. So the Arctic approach in Alaska, already the Russians have said that they own Alaska, that they only loaned it to us. And that it was about 25 years ago that the Russians, Liberal Democratic Party passed a bill in the Duma on how they would govern Alaska when they get it back. So this is not, and they've got big billboards in Russia saying, Alaska's ours. This is not a joke, but this is not to be unexpected. The Russian defector, GRU defector, Stanislav Lunev, before he defected in March of '92, because he spoke Mandarin, he was part of these groups that were negotiating with China on their future war plans. And they had a long-range plan to divide North America, where Russia would get Alaska and parts of Canada, and China would get the lower 48 states, with other countries invited in for looting rights. And this sounded so fantastic in the 1990s, but today it doesn't sound so fantastic.
It doesn't, indeed. And I guess what was fantastic until recently is becoming more, if not a certitude, certainly more of a distinct possibility. Jeff, there's been note made by, I think, Carla and some of our audience members about Greenland having the potential to be Cuba. Somebody, I think, put it on steroids. That is to say, vastly more wealthy in terms of those natural resources, and very much with a strategic position not dissimilar to that of Cuba in our own immediate littoral waters. What is your sense of the sentiment that the Greenlanders are exhibiting? Have you had a chance to look at that at all? We've heard some insights from some of the previous presenters, but is it your feeling that the independence would translate into essentially, if not de jure, de facto, a lash up with the Chinese and maybe the Russians as well?
You have to look at the ethnic makeup of the Greenland population, and the Chinese are particularly effective in their propaganda and the kind of things they do. Also, the Russians, you've got if you look at Dugan, hundreds of telegram groups appealing to different ethnic groupings with
Tell us
uniquely.
Who Dugan is again, please, Jeff.
Alexander Dugin is the Russian philosopher, but was recruited by the KGB in the 1980s to cultivate right-wing ideologies to appeal to conservatives, religious conservatives in different nations, whether it's Islamic conservatives, Hindu, Buddhist, Christian, Catholic, whatever kind of conservative it is, and to have this kind of perennialist outreach to all the groups and say, look, it's liberalism, it's America, it's Atlanticism, right? It's the Anglo-Saxons. They're the enemy of all religious belief. They're where all the atheism is coming from, blah, blah, blah. Of course, it's funny for the KGB to be pushing this, but liberation theology is too obvious, and you can't win over the really conservative people. And so what they want to do is I talked to an expert from Africa saying there's these telegram channels all over Africa. They're training up young people. They're trying to capture conservative elites in Africa. Same thing in South America. I've talked to people in Brazil about this. It's definitely happening. And you can very well expect that the Chinese have been active, and the Russians, by the way, Dugin has offices in China, so he's not just doing this for Russia. You can bet that they're having an influence on the indigenous people of Greenland. And that is very powerful. They obviously the Native Americans, indigenous people of northern Canada, were smart enough. Their tribal leadership understood that China was going to exploit them, and they did not. They were offered I was told, a rather large bribe, one of the significant tribes up there, and they turned them down. But just imagine if this could be effective in Greenland. The Chinese are trying to find an open door anywhere they can find it. And of course, that puts the U.S. government in a terrible position, because if the Chinese were to get into any of these places, we would not be able to allow it. We would have to intervene.
One would hope. I think in the environment we're in, who knows, but I think it is clearly something that is top of mind for President Trump. Jeff, to the extent that NORAD is woefully ill-equipped to contend with these various challenges, reference was made, I think, by Sam to the disparity between the number of icebreakers, for example, that the Russians have. I think some of them nuclear-powered, if I'm not mistaken. And the number that the United States has, it's just one example, but some of the statistics you gave us about the aircraft dedicated to, protecting Canadian and U.S. airspace, the number of missile defense interceptors that we've deployed, it suggests that we are wildly outgunned. As a sort of serious strategic analyst, what are the prospects of there being a turnaround in this particular arena? There's a lot of talk about the Western Pacific, for example, and being able to deter aggression by China there. But what is the likelihood we're going to see serious resources being invested in trying to do something about this much closer to home.
Without having to invest resources, the Canadians possess some technology that we don't have in the naval sphere that could be very useful if we could just get together with them and get some American money behind it. We could really be much more effective against these Russian and Chinese submarines, and that would cut down the threat because really it's these new cruise missiles that are on the submarines that are really a serious threat. And of course, we need more money put into this, into our nuclear deterrent and into our basic defensive infrastructure. We need to increase the number of fighter wings. I mean, 24 fighters is not even a fighter wing. I mean, a fighter wing is 4 times that number. So we used to have, I mean, what General Van Herk told me, and it was my understanding, we used to have 1,000 planes, 1,000 of fighters defending North American airspace. That's a really sad thing that we're down to such low numbers. And of course, that means a commitment to resources, that we have to put resources back into our military.
This is a fairly obvious conclusion from this program, as well as I think many of our previous ones. I think among the most troubling things this program has certainly Chinese penetration, not just of the Canadian government and the Greenland legislators and others, but these Indian tribes in northern Canada seeking to, I guess, bring them into the Belt and Road Initiative in a sense, whether it's true of Canada more generally or not, or simply, I think you said, flip the territory from their ownership to that of China. It's a staggering thought that you might actually have the Chinese owning what amount to military bases on Canadian soil. There's been, concern about the Canadian government allowing them to exercise winter exercises, as I recall.
Yeah, those were stopped
on Canadian soil, but they might actually take up permanent installations is extremely concerning. Go ahead.
Yeah, there's a lot of these old abandoned military bases in the far north which could be refitted, and it's something Canada needs to do, and people were discussing it. But the problem is these abandoned bases could be seized and used, and of course, with some work on them to improve them and to fix whatever's however meant the airstrips may be broken up, these bases could be quickly turned around, and instead of being a defensive line, could be an offensive line against the northern parts of the United States and Canada's south. People don't realize the Canadian North is really cut off, and they never developed. There's a sort of a semi-defunct rail line going to Churchill on the Hudson's Bay, but they have not built the infrastructure. They have not invested in the North, and this is something the Indigenous people, I'm sure, are not so happy about. There's a lot of resources we could use. It's more expensive to develop in the North, but once you've paid those infrastructure costs, you have access to those resources from then on. And that's something to think about, that maybe we need to pay the extra cost to develop resources that are right here in North America.
You've given us much to think about, as did our previous presenters. Thank you very much for being with us in person and taking a number of questions. Further, I think, underscoring the basic message of this particular webinar. The Arctic and the Canadian North, particularly Greenland, Alaska as well, are all in some jeopardy as the ambitions of our two main adversaries are continuing to manifest themselves in increasingly ominous ways. It seems my takeaway from this program is that President Trump is certainly right to be concerned about Greenland, but needs also to be concerned about what's happening in Canada And our policy approach towards that important alliance relationship needs to be thought carefully through in the context of these efforts to find a more fair and more sustainable trading relationship with the Canadians, as well as to attend to the shortfalls, the serious shortfalls in the national security investments of both nations in this particularly strategic region. Make no mistake about it, folks. This is another axis for threatening this country, for undermining it, possibly for actually attacking it, that left in the hands of not just one, but both of these hostile powers could be extremely perilous for the American people. We commend President Trump for his clarity on the homeland security challenges and his efforts to take corrective action. They need to be redoubled, and it seems to me they need to be strongly encouraged by those of us who are in a position to help our countrymen and women understand what is on the line and do what they can to encourage their elected representatives to assist in taking the kind of corrective action that's required. With that, I think we'll pause till next week's program. Thank you all for joining us and for your help in getting this very informative and very disturbing webinar of our Committee on the Present Danger China into the hands of people who have a need to know. And we're anxious to have them join us in future of these programs. It's a body of work that I think is extraordinary, if I do say so myself. And it is our hope that you will assist us in letting people know in your circles of influence that they're available for free. We encourage them to subscribe at presentdangerchina.org and to take action as we want to do in the Committee on the Present Danger China, not simply admire the problem, but to seek sorts of remedies that are urgently needed to secure the country we love. With that, I'll turn it back to you, Dee Dee. God bless you all. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you, Dee Dee. Taking it from here.
Thanks, Frank. A video of this webinar will be posted to presentdangerchina.org within a day or so of the conclusion of our program. The video posts to the same web page as the registration. So just go to the site and you'll find it there under webinars. Please share this and our other programs with your elected representatives, colleagues, and other networks, and subscribe to our Substack at presentdangerchina.substack and on X at CPD China for updates. Join us again next week for another installment of our Committee on the Present Danger China webinar series on the CCP's unrestricted warfare against America and the free world, and how CCP captured elites betray the USA. Thanks for being here. Goodbye.